Services Act, which is an important part of my life because it's eaten up years. Because it took a couple of years in fact, it took nearly 20 years for us to get the Tax Agent Services Act, and certainly from about 2007 a lot of work was put in by a number of people, including CPA Australia, on developing a framework which we think is fair and robust for tax agents and BAS agents, and of course how they interact. And that's why I think it's a fitting kind of start for the day. The topic is called Living the Code because really the Tax Agent Services Act, once you get through the gate and you're registered, and that can be a tortuous process for a lot of people, basically there's a code of conduct under the Tax Agent Services Act that we all have to adhere to, both registered tax agents and registered BAS agents. And really living with that code is really quite crucial. And the purpose of today is to highlight the benefits of that code, but also the duties and responsibilities that come with it. One thing I was going to say about the code just at the outset is that the way I see it, when you first look at it, it can appear intimidating because there's 14 principles and they sound like the 10 Commandments, the 14 Commandments or something, you know. And at first blush, they can appear rather onerous. The way I see it, though, it's very commonsensical. And we'll go through this code of conduct in quite some depth, but it's very commonsensical. The way I see it is, if you're giving advice, and I have a little tax agency on the side as well, which is what Robert was referring to in terms of coalface. The important thing, I think, in providing services, whether you're a BAS agent or a tax agent, is to take the view, well, I always want to be careful. I always want to only advise on the areas that I'm competent. I always want to check that the accounts are right or that I've got some basis for the view I've given, because I don't want to get sued. I don't want to be able to have to access my PI. I don't want to lose the client. I don't want my reputation damaged. I don't want to irritate the client or the tax agent I deal with. Therefore, I'll do all these things. So it's a very commonsensical thing, and it's really designed at the end of the day to trap those people who aren't committed in that sense. So that's what we mean by living the code. In terms of today, what I really was going to do is firstly just give you a quick historical context as to why the Tax Agent Services Act was introduced, and particularly as to why it was so important for bookkeepers. Then the bulk of the discussion really is aimed at discussing the 14 principles in the Code of Conduct and illustrate them with some case studies. And in essence, I guess, point out the pros and cons of it. I mentioned there are advantages and disadvantages with the code. The advantage of the code, I think, essentially is that it's going to ensure that people who aren't committed to ensuring that their work is competent, that it's prepared with reasonable care, that they've got a technical basis for the views that they apply, whether it's a tax agent or a BAS agent. If you don't adhere to those requirements, then you're going to have an exposure. And what that means is that those people who aren't committed to the professionalism you've got won't stay ultimately in the profession. Because at the end of the day, if you're not committed to adhere to those principles, really at some point you're going to be sanctioned out, or you'll find it just too hard, which will raise the level of status of everyone in the profession, whether a BAS agent or a tax agent. The downside, of course, is that you have to be aware of the rules and that it imposes a certain level of responsibility. But again, I think common sense will come into it. So we'll go through the 14 principles of conduct, we'll illustrate those with case studies, and then we'll talk about how sanctions can apply where there is a breach of the code. And that shouldn't scare you off necessarily either. What really happened, and one of the key reasons we wanted the Tax Agent Services Act introduced, was under the old rules, which have to operate a bit like Opus Dei or something from the Da Vinci Code, is that basically if you'd breached the old Tax Agent Services rules, the boards in those days could either do nothing or terminate your livelihood. The idea of sanctions going forward is that if someone does breach the code and it's relatively minor, you give it a slap on the wrist or a bit of a warning. There are other ways to remedy the defect, e.g. encouraging people to undertake further study or get mentoring, you can do that. And it's only really as a matter of last resort. For people, for example, engaged in fraud or something nasty, that they'll have their registration terminated. So it's quite an advance. So they're the three things I thought we'd talk about. Well, in terms of history, one big date that stays in everyone's mind is 1 July 2000. And when I read that last night, I thought, well, back in 1 July 2000, I'd worked about 18 months on implementing GST in a large corporate and a household name kind of corporate. And I have to say there were days and nightmares where I just think about the word GST, GST, GST. It was embraced in my mind. What I didn't realise though, because at that point, was that in a sense for small business and micro business, that the GST would be accompanied by a new phenomena, and that is the rapid growth in expertise in what we did call bookkeepers, now BAS agents. And really, the transition to the GST wouldn't have been able to take place as effectively if there wasn't that resource available to the community, and particularly to registered tax agents. Because not only would registered tax agents not have had the resources to handle that incremental workload without access to qualified assistance, the reality is over the last 12 or 15 years, the tax system generically has become massively, and I would say excessively complex. So there's plenty of work to keep tax agents busy, apart from having to do BASs, which can be quite intricate. My wife, who's the person I really report into, my wife has just completed a bookkeeping course sponsored by the AAT and is an AAT member, and it was interesting looking at it. I often read the GST Act, but when it actually comes down to compiling a BAS, I think learned a lot more from listening to her than anything else I've ever done. It's intricate. So if you actually look at the noughties, as the decade was, you had this rapid growth in bookkeeping, and in essence, that was a phenomenon which just grew very quickly. It grew in a period where there was no code, if you like, overseeing the provision of services. That meant there was no consumer protection. And of course that was relevant because the expertise of bookkeepers varied considerably. You had some people who might be doing it part-time occasionally, you had others who were very, very experienced. So as a result of that, there was a growing concern in the tax profession that we need to have some regulation of that, as well as lifting the status of BAS agents to a genuine para-profession. And I might add, all that's happening in a decade where the GST law is changing. Now, in my gig and experience, and I have to say I didn't plan my career this way, it just kind of happened, I've ended up looking at taxes all over the joint. I've done consolidations for multinationals, and I've done Division 7A and trusts for restructures of closely held groups, and I've done capital gains tax, worked in all kinds of industries, including the profession, and no tax is harder than GST. I've said that to everybody, including the Commissioner of Taxation. No tax is harder than GST. Why is that? Because the GST law, firstly, is appallingly written. It's a small volume of that length as opposed to the Income Tax Assessment Act, but you have to read things into it. Moreover, the GST law really is that much, because there's rulings, determinations, bulletins, and all these guidance products that support it. So, and it's a law which is constantly changing. One thing I did this week is there's a new draft ruling on tax invoices. We had a perfectly good ruling saying how tax invoices worked, issued in 2000. Well, they rewrote the law in 2010 to make some changes, and then they got a ruling which has taken away some of the discretions and flexibility that the tax office used to offer. So it's constantly changing. So for all those reasons, having really competent people as both BAS agents and tax agents working together is fundamental. You might have a BAS agent principally doing the BAS, and I know from a fact, having a few clients who in the area and seeing people that I work with as bookkeepers, I know the care and rigour that's applied in preparing the BAS. You also need that input from the tax agent, like have the rules on government charges changed, have the rules on tax invoices changed, have the rules on recipient creditor tax invoices been amended. They're talking about amending the property margin scheme, all that kind of interaction you need to talk about. And of course, one of the big problems in the last decade is that, as Robert alluded to, that them and us mentality between tax agents and BAS agents was there. CPA Australia recognised it, and that's why, together with the Institute of Chartered Accountants and the IPA, really encouraged the growth of the AAT, because we see the growth of a genuine bona fide profession that will be regulated and have professional standards, and that the two professions, if you like, will be working very closely in tandem. That's got to be the way to go forward. Interestingly, I spoke to the Tax Practitioners Board last week. There are 34,500 tax agents. They're now nearly 14,800 BAS agents, bookkeepers. And that's only going to increase more and more as we go forward. So where are we now? Well, we've got this regime called the Tax Agents Services Act, which people often call TASA. I had to get one acronym in for the day, so we'll use TASA. And its effective date was 1 March 2010. And really it's a milestone event, I think, for BAS agents, because it really formally recognised BAS agents as a genuine para-profession, and one which, if in most senses too, I think is very much considered akin to registered tax agents. Firstly, it defined what was meant by a BAS service and what a registered BAS agent could potentially provide in terms of services. Secondly, it provided some minimum standards in terms of academic qualifications and relevant work experience, so there's certain baseline level of expertise. I might note we're having a discussion in the lead up to the talk with one of the members of the audience, and either can have those qualifications or sit a competency exam in which to get accredited. But there is a certain baseline qualification. The registration process has been streamlined generically, and interestingly, the registration process for a BAS agent is the same for a tax agent, albeit with different qualifications and types of work experience. So there's this idea of bringing parity, for want of a better word, between the two professions. And crucially, both BAS agents and tax agents are subject to the Code of Professional Conduct. And I think if you really read the Tax Agents Services Act, you'll see that it does envisage a lot of collaborative behaviour between registered BAS agents and tax agents, which is why obviously things are working commercially in practice now. Well, the Code of Conduct, as I also mentioned before, really is advantageous because it provides a level playing field. And one of the key elements of it is that it means that those persons who aren't a member of a professional body like the AAT will have to meet the same standards in terms of competency, reasonable care, ongoing continuing professional education that you do. And that's only fair. If they want to be in the game, then why should they get a free kick when you do go to seminars, where you do go to discussion groups, where you do read AAT bulletins and the like? It's also fair in the sense it's applicable to tax agents and BAS agents. So there's no differential set of rules. The 14 commandments apply to both parties. The code itself is a simple statement of principles. There's 14 of them. Just as an aside, they also mimic, not identically, but very strongly, the principles of ethics that are involved in the provision of tax services that are imposed on accountants. And they're imposed on accountants under the bylaws that moderate the behaviour of all accountants who are members of the CPA Australia, the Institute of Chartered Accountants, and the IPA, which is APES 220, which deals with the provision of tax services. Now, if you do, after this session, want to find some more detail on the Code of Conduct, there is a regulatory information sheet available at the website of the Tax Practitioners Board, which is www.tpb.gov.au. This information sheet is kind of like a quasi-ruling. It's about 8 or 10 pages long, but it's quite useful. And it gives you some practical illustrations about how these principles work. Again, I come back to this mantra, don't see it as too intimidating, see it as commonsensical. You know, you want to keep your business intact, you don't want to have to make claims on your PI. Really, if you use that as your guiding principle, then I think you're not going to have an issue with the code. That said, there are 14 discrete principles, and what I was intending to do was go through each of the principles, illustrate with some case studies to show you how they worked. Well, not surprisingly, the very first principle is that you must act honestly.